So we've already spoken about the Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans, the Iliad and Odyssey were written about this age, the Bronze Age. Then we have the early Iron Age. And then we move into our era now, which is the Archaic period. This is what I spoke about during the first class, where the aristocracy, their networking, the Olympic gods, they syncretize the Olympic gods with all other local gods. The Olympic Games, trade is on the increase. It's the birth and growth of the polis in the Archaic period. But now we're going to talk about the Classical period, where we start to get democracy and eventually radical democracy. Radical democracy is a type of democracy none of us here have ever experienced. It's also known as direct democracy. It's not our system of government. It's one you will never experience unless you belong to a corporation that practices democratic policy making, which I don't know if that actually exists either. So we'll talk about what radical democracy is and why it's so unusual and unique. It has to do with our main question for today. So we are in the classical period of Greece, and here we are, Athens. In Attica, the area is known as Attica. That's your polis, Athens and Attica all together, not just the city of Athens. So we want to talk about some changes that are happening in the classical era that moves us closer to democracy. So here we go. Change in warfare, part one. You have two changes in warfare that influence democracy. Without them, radical democracy would not have occurred, as far as I can tell, and most historians that I've talked to will concur that without these changes in the military structure, democracy, especially radical democracy, could not have occurred. So here we go. What is a hoplite warrior? But hoplites, when we say a compact formation, they are literally pressing shoulder to shoulder, and so you're going to have a whole group of people. You actually have what they call heavily armored. Most of us being more European inclined, we would look at their half-naked bodies and say, heavy armor? No, that's not heavy armor. Not even close, full plate mail armor from our, European medieval past makes that pale in comparison. But the hoplite warriors at the time were considered heavily armored. When you look at a lot of other cultures, in particular the Persians, their armor was, leather if they were lucky, wicker armor, wicker shields, spears, bows and arrows, whereas the average hoplite was equipped with quite a bit of metal on their body, and that gave them a big advantage. The phalanx, that compact formation that I'm discussing, has to do with pressing a bunch of soldiers together and moving them forward quickly at a higher rate. It's sort of a combined mass. And so the strategy here is that if you have your phalanx charge another group of people, another phalanx are just a bunch of barbarians who are disorganized, and if you can crash into and have a superior velocity and momentum to your enemy, these two phalanx units crashing into each other, the one whose front line breaks first, they're the ones who lose. Like, let's say 99% of the time. So a really high probability that if you have superior momentum and you just crash through that front line of your enemy, everyone else is going to run away, and you start slaughtering people who have already fallen down in front of you. So it has a lot to do with bashing into each other with high momentum, staying highly compact, so it's not just the momentum of one person in armor, it's everybody together pressing behind their big hoplite shield. The spear is the main weapon, of course. The spear is not thrown, but it's to stab in various positions from behind your shield while you're still protected. It's a pretty big shield, so you can see that there wasn't a lot of thigh armor. You had shin and some chest and head armor. Well, that's because that shield covered some of those other vital areas. You were supposed to stay behind that shield at all times. You weren't supposed to drop that shield. They did carry a shorter sword. This was a type of sword you execute with. It was short. Long swords, quite honestly, they're not that good for murder. A short sword is much better for close combat murder. You want to reach the heart with the sword. So their swords were short. Those longer swords come later when we need more of a heavy impact with a blade because we're fighting super heavily armored knights in the Middle Ages. There were other cultures that had heavy swords, but they never reached the level of the Hoplites. Yes? And so the interesting thing is why the Hoplites are different than soldiers in the past. If we look at the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and even the Mycenaean Greeks from the Bronze Age, who are your warriors? Anyone know? Okay, so basically the idea is that most warriors, Greek warriors and others, are aristocratic. And they often ride horses, you know. Of course, you had cavalry units at this time, but the Hoplite soldiers became much more favored a ground-style combat in early skirmishes with the Persians. They had superior armor, they could beat the Persians could outnumber them, and they were superior warriors. Now, Hoplites, since they're not aristocrats, what are they? They're farmers. And so your infantry combat at this time happened in the off-season. So you have a growing season and a harvest season. Well, you're not going to wage war at that time. Like hardly anyone in Greece, except Sparta, could wage war in the growing season. Sparta was really the only place that had professional full-time soldiers, much different than Athens. We probably won't have a chance to get into Sparta a whole lot. So because Hoplites became so important for warfare, for Greeks in general, but for the city of Athens, and plus because conditions were so poor in Athens in terms of aristocrats controlling government and exploiting farmers and laborers and that sort of thing, there was actually a revolt real early on in the dark part of early classical and late archaic Greece, where there was some kind of revolt for some reason. We kind of know why. It's just exploitation by the aristocracy. Well, you get a Hoplite revolt. Now, these Hoplites are often landowners, they're farmers, but they're just not aristocrats, right? So really today, they're kind of like your middle class. They're not super poor. They're definitely not poor. But they're definitely not, usually not rich, and they're definitely not aristocratic. It's because your Hoplites, because of that change in warfare, and because of a revolt, and because they're more important, they actually want more of a say in government. They don't want to be exploited because they're providing so many things for the government, their lives, for example, that now, because of this change in warfare, we get a movement toward democracy, our first real movement towards democracy. We get that with Solon and Draco, also known as Drakon. If you've ever heard the term a draconian measure, using draconian measures, it means someone who performs deeds without compassion. They're harsh. They get the job done, but they're harsh, draconian. This was named after Draco, or otherwise known as Drakon, at this time. So during this time of unrest with these Hoplites, Draco's like, okay, this is what we do. We come up with a bunch of laws to make sure that no one's being exploited. Okay? So you get some of your real early Athenian laws from Draco. It didn't work. Time went on, there was another revolt by the Hoplite class. Solon was elected to take over from the aristocracy, and he set up some systems to decrease exploitation. Solon set many of the more compassionate laws, early laws. Many laws would be attributed to Solon, even though they were not. So Solon, to many people, is considered sort of the grandfather of democracy. He created an early idea of the assembly, and that's a group of citizens, not just elders, citizens that get together and influence policy. But that never was instituted right away. The aristocrats were still very strong, but we get a short movement, a small movement toward democracy. That Hoplite class wants more say in government. Now, there's another issue with the Persians, and of course, it's a 100 level class. I've got to pour through this material. I won't have time to talk about the wars that took place, but you actually get skirmishes with Persia. You're fighting with the Spartans in many cases, and other fellow Greeks, and eventually Greek turns against Greek in the Peloponnesian War. But what's happening with Athens is they're realizing that their real strength is in their navy. So they're more like Great Britain, and Sparta is kind of like France, you know, during the 100 Years' War, or later than the 100 Years' War. But the basic idea in Europe is that England has a great, strong navy that cannot be rivaled. And then France, you know, especially under Napoleon and Louis XIV, had the strong infantry that could not be rivaled. So what you have is with the Athenians, they're coming to terms with the idea that they need to have a strong navy. This starts making them very wealthy because they can have all these colonies where they're bringing in goods with their navy. They can control all these different island and coastal nations. They're actually becoming an empire. At the same time, they become the most democratic. There's a lot of irony in there. So because they are now, most of their power is in the ships and not the hoplite infantry, you need what for ships? You need a lot of rowers. So these guys, although they had triremes that had sails and that sort of thing, you had rows and rows of rowers, right, out of the side of the ship that were just rowing to go quickly. And essentially what we do with naval combat is you would ram each other. So you'd go at a high speed and you'd try to ram the person in the front. You had a hard piece in the front of your trireme and you would break the other person's ship and it would just sink. So these rowers are poor people, the Thetes, the Thete class. Hoplites don't enroll as rowers. They have a farm. They have much more pride in their role as a hoplite warrior. But as the Navy becomes more important, these Thete rowers actually imitate what the hoplites did much, much earlier on. There is revolt, mistreatment, and these poor people, because now they're so important and celebrated as rowers, even though there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, they now want a say in democracy. Okay, so this is almost like looking at the middle class, you know, around the time of the French Revolution. They want more of a say in the government because the aristocracy and the clergy are really the only ones who have privileges and a say in government. Right? So that's very similar to this hoplite class. So it's almost like letting in your farmer middle class. That moves you closer to democracy. More people have a say in government. Get down to the poor class, male citizens, of course, not the slaves who operate as rowers. They now want a say in government. And so when this change comes, so that was your change in warfare part 2, we now get to radical democracy. Now, radical and direct democracy has a lot to do with letting most of your citizen body vote. Of course, females aren't voting at this time, but male citizens are voting. Now it's no matter your economic level. Before you had to have certain property requirements to vote. Now, any male Athenian citizen can vote. This is getting close to the definition of radical democracy. Radical democracy has more to do with something quite different than what we do now. Does everyone know what the popular vote is in the United States? The popular vote? It's a majority vote of the population who vote, right? But we don't vote our president in with that, right? We count the popular vote, and we report on it, right, on the news, but it doesn't determine who wins the presidency. It's the Electoral College that determines the presidency. This was different than radical democracy. Radical democracy is now your vote can count as one vote. So if we all were a sample group from Athens, and we're all at different economic levels, we're all male citizens, of course, we could go into the assembly, the Ekklesia, and in the course of one day determine if we're going to war or not. Now, it's not the generals who are determining if you're going to war or not the Senate who's determining that, but just the voting body itself can determine in one day if you're going to go to war or not. And the Ekklesia would determine foreign and domestic policies in general. They were very powerful. Anywhere from drainage pipes in Athens, they would decide on that, to who we're going to trade with, who we're not going to trade with, who we're going to punish, who we're going to go to war with. Do we need to change our baseline grain prices because of inflation? Regular voters are doing this, you know? Not what we do. We elect representatives to vote for us. Right? When it comes to actual bills, foreign and domestic policy. It's not like the president when we vote for the president. All right? So we're not actually anywhere close to the type of democracy Athens had. They had a real democracy, a radical, direct democracy. And the word direct works nicely because your vote directly equals one vote toward whatever the initiative is, whatever the bill is. They could have multiple votes a day. Yep. And usually, you know, when we write a bill and present it, it was kind of similar to that. You could, the boule, the assembly of 500 would determine, what are we going to vote on today? So it was a real limited number. But it was very flexible and open, and it was very actually frightening. Even though it's exciting when you think about radical democracy, it was very frightening. So does everyone understand the difference between radical democracy and our modern government? Our modern government is called what? So it is a form of democracy, but it's a representative democracy, also known as a republic. Here's your big question. How did Athenians create a government and legal system based on principles of radical democracy? I'm going to go through our bullet points here. Here are the steps they took. Once they decided direct democracy and radical democracy is going to happen, here are the steps they had to take. Okay? Dismantling privilege, government and temple. Ephialtes and so many others and Pericles set out to dismantle the privileges of the aristocracy. And the aristocracy were also usually your priestly castes. So, family legacies would rule certain temples. And so they were serious about radical democracy and dismantling privilege at this time. They wanted to get rid of the aristocracy. They didn't want anyone around who could exploit others. So when you dismantle privilege, that means your government roles are now democratically elected or chosen by lot. They did a lot of choosing by lot. So instead of people getting together and voting, you just choose randomly when you choose by lot. It's like we all put our names in a bucket and pull one out. Well, that's even more democratic in a way. It's even more, it's like, everyone has a chance. It doesn't have to do with like current public opinion. Like we like one person now, but we hate another, but it's really because we're jealous of that person. Because humans are pretty fickle, right? So choosing by lot is a way to take out corruption, right? It's totally random. The temples were cleansed. The temple positions, this is of course what we'd call a pagan society, of course. And your temples were often operated, they were city temples in a way. And many of these temples controlled festivals that happened throughout the year and did certain things for the public. But now the government of Athens took out these family legacies that were serving these temples and decided to basically elect and choose by lot who would administer the temple for that year. You could be, Aphrodite's chief priest, like for all of 2017. Yeah, exactly. So that's pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool. So we're dismantling privilege, taking aristocracy out of everything, government and temple. Prosecution, Hoplite, that is now has to do with legal code. So now any citizen can prosecute somebody who's breaking a law. Now this sounds a little bit weird, but before, everyday citizens couldn't point something at some piece of corruption that was going on by, say, an aristocrat or a business owner or a landowner, and then have them prosecuted. But now, any average Joe can prosecute somebody in court. And this is good. This is very good for dismantling privilege and making the legal structure happen. They only had 11 police at any one time, so it's not like they had a huge police force that would go around and enforce these laws. You and I, average citizens, were expected to enforce the laws and prosecute. We also usually got a financial reward if we won. This led to many corrupt people called sycophants, different definition than what we have for the word sycophant now. Sycophants who would go around suing people just because they knew they could win the case and win some money. I can explain why. Democratic courts, large jury chosen by lot. So we all know what a jury is. Our jury that would hear our case, say you stole something, and a jury would be chosen by lot. And you would have from anywhere from 51 to 1,500 people in your jury listening to your case. And then they would vote at the end. And the majority vote wins. So if you have 100 people and 51 vote to execute you, you're going to be executed. Very interesting. So it's a way of bringing democracy into the courts. It's sloppy, but it's democracy. Majority vote wins, just like I said. And so these people that go around prosecuting each other, like people who are making a career off suing people, they did that in Athens. And because they had a large jury chosen by lot, speech and persuasion became super important at this time. We get a lot of our great ideas about rhetoric from Aristotle, who existed right at the end of this era and wrote about it. So did Plato and so many others. They wrote about how to persuade people. Well, why were they so focused on persuading people? Because of the democratic courts. So you could now sue somebody or even win in the Ekklesia, convince your entire country to go to war if you're good at persuading people. And this was no joke. You would have great leaders who were simply great at persuading. And of course, we can understand that if we follow politics, people who are very persuasive. But, so you could take someone to court, and as long as you persuaded, with, say, probability arguments, which are illegal now in modern courtrooms, you can persuade that audience to think that that person really did something wrong, and you can win a financial reward for that. So that's a good example of that. Offices are not held very long. That's another very important feature, right? In the US, they can only serve a 4-year term, and if they get voted back in, they can serve a total of 8 years, then they're out. In Athens, some positions, you're in for a year and then you're out. It could be a major position, but you know you're only going to hold it for a year. It prevents corruption, right? Prevents corruption and so many other things that come with holding on to power. Election and lottery, I talked about that already. You elect someone, the democratic body elects someone, or you get a huge pool of 2,000 people together who want this position and you just choose randomly, right? That's lottery. And the assembly. The assembly would get together, male citizens, and in one day could determine foreign and domestic policy. It's really cool, but it's also very scary. There are positives and negatives to radical democracy.